Welcome to Your Soul Rising. In this video, I lecture through Book 3 of the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It helps this community learn and grow together, even though your subscription is free. And before we get started, grab a blanket, get a hot drink, get cozy, and enjoy the sounds of the fireplace crackling in the background. In Book 3, philosophy now leads Boethius from negation into vision. Having dismantled his illusions about wealth, fame, power, and pleasure in Book 2, she turns in Book 3 to something deeper, the search for the true nature of happiness. This is not a comfort offered in suffering. It's a fundamental question about what happiness is and why everything else fails to satisfy. She begins gently by asking Boethius what he had once believed to be the highest good. He answers, wealth, honor, power, things that fortune once gave him. But philosophy reminds him that if these things can be taken away, they cannot be the true good. And Boethius agrees. She has prepared him to see through the glitter of appearances. Now she must show him what lies beyond them. She argues that every human desire points toward a single goal, happiness, that is, complete, self-sufficient fulfillment. Though people chase after many things, all are in truth seeking one thing under many disguises. The miser wants wealth not for coins, but for security. The ambitious man wants office, not for ceremony, but for honor. The tyrant wants power, but not for its own sake. What he wants is the control and freedom from fear, a sense of invulnerability. Strip away the surface, and each desire is revealed as a distorted form of the same longing, to be whole, free, and at peace. But the problem is that these substitutes actually fail to deliver what they promise. Wealth cannot satisfy. It only breeds desire for more. And fame cannot last, for it depends on others and vanishes over time. Power creates fear and attracts enemies. Pleasure fades and often leaves a person emptier than before. None of these so-called goods are stable or sufficient or truly our own. They promise happiness, but they deliver anxiety. So then philosophy guides Boethius to a critical insight. If these partial goods are reflections of some higher good, then that higher good must be one. It must be complete, eternal, and self-sufficient. True happiness must consist not in possessing things, but in possessing the source of all goodness itself. That source is what philosophy names the highest good, and it is no less than God. This is not a leap into blind faith, of course. For Boethius, God is defined rationally as the good toward which all things move, the unmoved mover, the source of being, the cause of order, unity, and beauty. Philosophy reasons that what is truly good must be unchanging, independent, perfect, and creative. It must give goodness without needing to receive it. And if happiness is the possession of that good, then to be happy is, in some sense, to be joined to the divine. She quotes earlier philosophers, echoes Plato, calls forth the voice of wisdom through both argument and poetic song. Her prose gives clarity, and her poems stir the soul, as they have throughout the Consolation of Philosophy. Through both of these styles, she shows that all created goods are rays from a single sun, the good itself, capital G. When the soul turns towards the rays, it receives light. But when it mistakes the rays for the source, it falls into confusion and suffering. Boethius listens, and something begins to rise in him. Clarity. He begins to understand that he once chased reflections, not reality. He did not err in desiring happiness. Every soul seeks it. His error was in attaching that desire to fleeting things. The soul was made for more. It was made for what does not pass away. In one of the most profound arguments of the book, philosophy contends that if God is the highest good, and happiness is the possession of the good, then God is happiness itself. To seek happiness, therefore, is to seek God, not as an external being, but as the fulfillment of one's own deepest nature. To know the good is to become like it. Thus, the philosophical and spiritual life is not escape from the world, but the soul's return to its own center, a very Platonic and Gnostic idea. And yet, philosophy does not ignore the complexity of the human condition. She acknowledges that the soul, though divine in origin, is trapped in the body, distracted by sensation, drawn toward false images. She compares this to a king forgetting his identity and living like a slave. Book 3 is a call to remembrance, to wake up, to see what is truly worthy, and to begin the ascent back to the source. This culminates in the final poem, which is a hymn to divine harmony. In it, philosophy praises the cosmic order, how God governs the heavens, how love binds all things together, how the elements obey proportion, and how the soul itself is a bridge of threefold nature, mind, body, and spirit, animated by divine reason. She prays that the order of the stars might also descend into human life, that justice and goodness may reign on earth as they do in the heavens. The poem offers more than beauty. It gives us a metaphysical vision. The cosmos is not chaos. It is not governed by chance. It is ruled by reason, sustained by love, animated by a soul that moves through all things. And to be happy is not to control the world, but rather to live in harmony with it. So by the end of Book 3, Boethius has not yet resolved his personal fate, nor has philosophy yet answered the paradoxes of fate and free will. But something fundamental has shifted. He no longer asks, "Why have I lost everything?" Instead, he begins to ask, "What is the good that cannot be lost?" The soul, once weeping in chains, now looks toward the light, not as something distant, but as the very substance of its being. Okay, that was the summary of Book 3, and now, as always, I'll take you through chapter by chapter, giving you my notes on each section. This Book 3 is the kind of climax or turning point of the entire work, so there's quite a bit here, especially as we get toward the end. But starting in chapter 1 of Book 3, we see Boethius very much eager to continue learning. He says, "I'm so eager to hear more, I fervently beg you." "I knew it," she replied. "Once you began to hang on my words in silent attention, I was expecting you to adopt this attitude, or rather, to be more exact, I myself created it in you. The remedies still to come are, in fact, of such a kind that they taste bitter to the tongue, but grow sweet once they are absorbed. But you say you are eager to hear more. You would be more than eager if you knew the destination I am trying to bring you to." I asked what it was, and she told me that it was true happiness. "Your mind dreams of it," she says, "but your sight is clouded by shadows of happiness and cannot see reality." I begged her to lead on and show me the nature of true happiness without delay. So here we see the eagerness that we have after we come out of the dark night of the soul, which is the stage of the ascension process that Boethius has been enduring in books 1 and 2, and indeed even prior to the book opening. But now he's on the upswing. He is beginning his true ascension, and this is where Lady Philosophy is going to lead him, beginning here in Book 3. We can compare Lady Philosophy here to concepts like the Holy Spirit, the higher self, the oversoul. In other words, the teachings that this force will provide are still going to be bitter to the ego complex until they are absorbed into the personality and embodied, at which point Boethius's identity, and we can extrapolate that to our own when we undergo our ascension processes, will become new, will become born again. That is the idea at play here. Then a bit further down the page, she says, "First, I will try to describe and sketch an idea of the cause of happiness. Then, with a proper vision of that, you will be able to turn your gaze in a different direction and recognize the pattern of true happiness. turn your gaze in a different direction here brings our attention to the very power of attention itself. In other words, how we attend to reality is, in a sense, what renders our experience of it. And so she's going to turn his attention away from the illusions, the illusory happiness, back to the true reality, or actual highest good. To know the truth, one must experience the illusion, however, and then rise out of it. It's kind of the purpose of incarnating into the illusion is to know true reality by experiencing that which it is not. This is a very Platonic idea, and she goes on to describe exactly that point in the poem that closes chapter 1. Whoever wants to sow in virgin soil first frees the fields of undergrowth and bush, cuts back thick ferns and brambles with the scythe, and clears the way for crops of swelling wheat. The tongue that first has tasted bitter food finds honey that the bees have won more sweet, and stars shine out more pleasing to the eye. When from the south the rain-winged wind has dropped, first the morning star gives chase to night, then beauteous day drives in his rosy steeds. You too have seen the face of spurious good, from whose ill yoke you start to raise your neck, and true good now shall penetrate your mind. As we get into chapter 2, we once again see the theme of souls forgetting their nature. They don't change their nature. Even while they're ignorant, they're still pursuing the good, the highest good, that is their nature. But they have a case of amnesia, and the ascension process, especially in the Neoplatonic and Platonic systems, is one of remembrance. The book says, "For the desire for true good is planted by nature in the minds of men. Only error leads them astray towards false good." There is, in fact, no way to not pursue the highest good. Even when we're pursuing an illusory good, our intention is still to reach the highest good. It's a very Augustinian idea as well in his theology, that even, for instance, an atheist is pursuing truth. And because God is the highest truth, the atheist actually is pursuing God without realizing it. That notion, of course, finds its origination here in a very Platonic theme of the cosmos. The rest of chapter 2, Lady Philosophy reminds Boethius that material things promise fullness, but they ultimately still lead to worry, to lack, scarcity, inadequacy. Once more, even though we still pursue the highest good, always, that is found in things that are permanent, that are eternal, whereas material things are by definition changing, mutable, contingent, and impermanent. It's an idea that finds resonance with Buddhism, where we need to cut our attachments to things that are impermanent and return to the permanence of our true nature. And in the Platonic and Gnostic systems, for instance, the Hermetic system, even Christianity, which has disagreements with all of those, there is a common theme across all of those traditions of the fullness of the divinity, as opposed to the inadequacy or the lack and scarcity of the illusion that is the material. We get quite a long passage of poetry to close out chapter 2. I'll just call attention to this bit of it that kind of captures the main point. "A bird which clattered noisily when free into a cage is taken from the tree. Though cups are set all sweet with honey there, and food in plenty with the sweetest care, is ministered by men in their delight, it flutters in the cage and catches sight of where the pleasant woodland shade is cast. The food beneath its feet is scattered fast. Now for the wood alone she sadly longs, for the woods alone she sings her whispered songs." In other words, you can have all the material comforts that are possible, but there is still the nature of the soul that longs for its freedom. No amount of wealth or power or comfort is going to be a substitute for the actual true nature of the soul in its fullness. In a sense, even the comforts of the material realm are still bars of the cage of the illusion. And then in the next several chapters, philosophy goes through each of those illusory comforts, those illusory senses of happiness, and argues in various ways why they are not the true happiness. So she starts out with wealth in chapter 3, saying, "So that wealth cannot make a man free of want and self-sufficient, though this was the very promise we saw it offering. And this too, I think, is a point of great importance, namely the fact that money has no inherent property such as to stop it being taken away from those who possess it against their will. And also, wealth which was thought to make a man self-sufficient, in fact, makes him dependent on outside help. In which case, what is the way in which riches remove want? If you say that rich people do have the means of satisfying hunger and driving away thirst and cold, I will reply that although want can be checked in this way by riches, it can't be entirely removed. Every hungry and clamorous want may be satisfied with the help of riches, but the want which admits of being satisfied necessarily still remains. There is no need for me to mention that nature is satisfied with little, whereas nothing satisfies greed. So that, if so far from being able to remove want, riches create a want of their own, there is no reason for you to believe that they confer self-sufficiency. So again, as a material thing, we see that wealth has a dual nature. Its positive pole is that it satisfies the desires for food, shelter, water, the necessities. Its negative pole is that it creates greed that can never be satisfied, it creates the fear that you will lose the wealth, so on and so forth. Again, the theme of the divine fullness versus the material illusion of deficiency. In chapter 4, she moves on to public office, another one of Boethius's favorite illusory happinesses, and points out that this is also material, dual, and thus an illusory happiness. True respect, she says, cannot be obtained through the insubstantial honors of high office. Take the example of a man who has been consul many times and comes by chance among foreign peoples. Would his offices make him respected by them? And then later on, if therefore high offices cannot make people worthy of respect, and if furthermore they become tarnished by contact with evil men, if their splendor can disappear with the change of time and they grow cheap in the estimation of foreign peoples, without asking what beauty they can confer, what beauty worth desiring do they even possess? So again, as a material thing, public office is itself pretty meaningless and has a dual nature in the sense that it's the quality of the consciousness that holds the public office that determines if it is actually good or bad or somewhere in between. Whereas the highest good, true happiness, is just the good. It's the capital G good. It does not have a dual nature. It is an all-encompassing unity. In chapter 5, she talks about a related topic, which is power. She says, "What is this power, then, which cannot banish the nagging of worry or avoid the pinprick of fear? Kings would like to live free from worry, but they can't. And then they boast of their power. Do you think of a man as powerful when you see him lacking something which he cannot achieve? A man who goes about with a bodyguard, because he is more afraid than the subjects he terrorizes, and whose claim to power depends upon the will of those who serve him." So in other words, power is fleeting, impermanent. It also leads to worry, just as wealth does, that it will be taken away from you. The king is always looking over his shoulder, in spite of the fact that he has tremendous material power and comfort. We also see again another example of the state of consciousness being more real or more important than the material state. That state of worry is in fact a higher degree of negative than is the degree of positive that comes from having the power in the first place. And then chapter 6, she tackles fame and nobility, saying, "And even if the praise is deserved, it cannot add anything to the philosopher's feelings. He measures happiness not by popularity, but by the true voice of his own conscience." That's about as clear as we can be that the internal, the interiority, is superior to the material, the external. Fame and nobility, as she argues in this chapter, is another impermanent, dual, material, illusory happiness. But here we see another argument that she gives that she doesn't really give in the other sections, and that is in the poem at the end. She says, "From one beginning rises all mankind. For one Lord rules and fathers all things born. He gave the sun his light, the moon her horns, and men to earth and stars to deck the sky. He clothed in bodies minds brought down from high, a noble origin for mortal men. Why then proclaim your kin and ancestry? Look whence you came and see who made you, God. No man is base, except through sin he quit his proper source to cherish meaner things. So essentially, she's giving us a bit of foreshadowing about the unity of the divine that she's going to talk about later. The argument here is, well, why consider yourself famous, noble, better than others, when everyone's source is in fact the same God, the same reality? In other words, all is one. So nobility is just a straight-up illusion. Incidentally, this is also the remedy for all of humanity's ills, is the concept of the law of one, the idea that everything is the same reality experiencing itself. Then in chapter 7, we go to pleasures, which once again she points out are impermanent and dual. We already talked about this quite a bit in book 2, so this is a pretty short chapter. But in the poem at the end, we can recall and reflect on everything we learned about fortune back in book 2. All pleasures have one quality alike. They drive their devotees with goads, and like a swarm of bees upon the wing, they first pour out their honey loads, then turn and strike their victim's heart and leave behind their deep-set sting. So again, pleasure, fortune, these are dual. There's a rhythm to them. If you experience good fortune now, there will be a time when you have misfortune. And eventually, it goes back again. But the only thing you can count on is its mutability. Chapter 8 is where we really start getting into some depth of material here. It opens with, "There is no doubt, then, that these roads to happiness are sidetracks and cannot bring us to the destination they promise. The evils with which they are beset are great, as I will briefly show you." So in a sense, all of these illusory happinesses are not just false. They are sidetracks. They are traps on the spiritual journey, distractions that pull the soul away from its ascension. A little bit further down, she says, "Look up at the vault of heaven, see the strength of its foundation and the speed of its movement, and stop admiring things that are worthless. Yet the heavens are less wonderful for their foundation and speed than for the order that rules them." Now, something to remember, and something that my copy of the book has a very long footnote about, is that at this time the conception of the heavens was the Ptolemaic universe. That is, with Earth at the center, the 7 planetary spheres, one of which is actually the sun, the 8th sphere of the sidereal layer, and then the 9th sphere as God, as heaven. Now, the footnote here takes a very modern physicalist view of this, basically saying, what a quaint cosmology that was, but of course now it's been refuted, and we know that the sun is the center of the solar system, and that Earth is not the center of the universe, let alone the solar system. What I would suggest to you, and I have a video about this topic exclusively on the channel as well, is that the Ptolemaic universe is a psychological model that's still useful for us today if we treat it in that respect. It has way more layers of meaning than just the physical or scientific level. The idea is that the ego is represented by the earth. It always perceives itself at the center, and that's our default starting point. As the soul ascends, it goes past each of the 7 planetary spheres. Each one is a threshold to cross. Each one can be personified as a kind of guardian that requests a sacrifice in order for you to pass. And so at each one, the ego releases another attachment that it has. And each planet symbolically represents a category of attachment, similar to the way philosophy has walked us through things like wealth and fame, nobility. For example, Mars is physical aggression over others. Venus is attachment to beauty and outward appearances. So they're all on theme and tied into mythology. Eventually, you get to the sidereal layer, where you have given up all material attachments, but you are still clinging to the egoic identity. But you're almost there, and in the 9th, the final layer, you give up that separation entirely, that identity, and merge back with the divine, or acknowledge your soul's highest nature, that of God himself. Some other cool things to note about this system, you can probably guess its connection to astrology, the idea that the planets govern the fate or the destiny of humans, especially the motions of the ego, and that once you shed that egoic identity, you are no longer a victim of fate. You can actually get in there and change your own destiny through conscious self-determination. The number 9 is also significant in these ancient worldviews. For instance, Christianity has the 9 levels of heaven, and 9 has always been the number of completion or fullness. So the 9th level being the pleroma or heaven, the fullness of the divine, is symbolically significant. Anyway, that one little line there about the order of the foundation of the heavens actually contains quite a bit of good information to help us model psychologically through personification and through kind of a physical metaphor the soul's ascension process. Continuing on, also in that same chapter, we get the line, "Think how excessive this desire for the good of the body is when, as you know, all that you admire can be reduced to nothing by 3 days of burning fever." So Saturn in that Ptolemaic cosmology symbolically represents our attachment to life itself, the fear of death. And so the body here, philosophy says, is also impermanent. So don't get attached to that. That is also not the source of true happiness. In order to pass by Saturn, you have to let go of your attachments to this material life itself. Then, in the last bit just before the poem, she says, "The sum of all this is that because they can neither produce the good they promise, nor come to perfection by the combination of all good, these things are not the way to happiness, and cannot by themselves make people happy." She says, "Alas, what wretched ignorance leads mankind from the path astray." So again, the idea of ignorance versus gnosis of the true nature. That ignorance is the cause of evil. Evil is not something that has existence in and of itself. It is a privation of knowledge. Very Platonic idea. A little bit later on in the poem, we get the lines, "But in their blindness they do not know where lies the good they seek. That which is higher than the sky, on earth below they seek. What can I wish, you foolish men? Wealth and fame pursue, and when great toil wins false reward, then may you see the true." So in other words, these false rewards, the hardship that we experience in the material life, actually is useful. It catalyzes us to seek the actual truth and the actual good that lies outside the illusion in the divine. It's what actually inspires the soul to break out of the illusion. If not for that suffering, there'd be no motivation to do so. So it's only because of that the soul ever undergoes the process of remembrance. The other idea here is that the material points to the good as an expression of it, but it cannot provide the highest good itself. We come then to chapter 9, which is the climax of the book. We turn from arguments about the material to starting to talk about the highest good itself. We get the line, "That which is one and undivided is mistakenly subdivided and removed by men from the state of truth and perfection to a state of falseness and imperfection." So in other words, humanity's desire is to kind of carve things up, break them up, separate them. The illusion of separation here is contrasted to the divine fullness, the divine unity, the one from the Neoplatonic system. Lots of major spiritual traditions have the same theme. We also see it in a neuroscientific model, about which I've also made a video on this channel, Ian McGilchrist's work on the 2 hemispheres of the brain, and how the left hemisphere performs the function of dividing up, carving up, and that this is kind of the seat of the ego, whereas the right hemisphere, which is supposed to be the master of the brain, not the left hemisphere, is the one that takes in reality as a whole experience, cares about the nuance and the betweenness, the harmony, whereas the left hemisphere wants to break things up and cannot even understand wholeness. So again, even in our own brains, there's this contrast of the illusion of separation that can be of service, but the truer reality, or the one that's supposed to be the master, is the one of wholeness, fulfillment, the divine one. So if you'd like to learn more about Ian McGilchrist's book, you can check out my lecture on that here on the channel. And again, I'll remind you that the Ptolemaic Universe for Psychology lecture is also here on the channel as well. Back to Boethius, however, a little bit further down we get the line, "Human perversity then makes divisions of that which by nature is one and simple, and in attempting to obtain part of something which has no parts, succeeds in getting neither the part, which is nothing, nor the whole, which they are not interested in." Again, pretty much exactly what we just described, particularly the way that the two hemispheres operate in their worldviews, perspectives on reality. Again, very Neoplatonic and Platonic idea here. There's the one, the all, the true essence of reality. It is the absolute, and the soul is a spark of this. We can also go way back to the beginning of the Consolation of Philosophy, to the description of the dress that Lady Philosophy is wearing. If you recall, scraps had been torn off of it by perverse people who were satisfied with just a scrap of the truth, which they then paraded around thinking was the whole truth. So again, we have here in this line, this passage, that human perversity makes divisions of that which is one and simple. So Lady Philosophy is kind of the expression of absolute truth, absolute philosophy, which again would be part of God. Still further, we get to the real crux of Book 3 with the lines, "Which is the very thing I have longed and eagerly been waiting for." That's Boethius. "But since in the Timaeus my servant Plato," says Lady Philosophy, "was pleased to ask for divine help even over small matters, what do you think we ought to do now in order to be worthy of discovering the source of the supreme good?" Boethius says we ought to pray to the Father of all things. To omit to do so would not be laying a proper foundation. "Right," she says, and immediately begins the following hymn. "O thou who dost by everlasting reason rule, creator of the planets and sky, who time, from timelessness dost bring, unchanging mover, no cause drove thee to mold unstable matter, but the form benign of highest good within thee set. All things thou bringest forth from thy high archetype. Thou height of beauty, in thy mind the beauteous world dost bear, and in that ideal likeness shaping it, dost order perfect parts a perfect whole to frame. The elements by harmony thou dost constrain, that hot to cold and wet to dry are equal made, that fire grow not too light, or earth too fraught with weight. The bridge of threefold nature matest thou, soul, which spreads through nature's limbs harmonious, and all things moves. The soul once cut in circles to its motions join, goes round and to itself returns in circling mind, and turns in patterns similar the firmament. From causes like thou bringst forth souls and lesser lives, which from above in chariots swift thou dost disperse, through sky and earth, and by thy law benign, they turn, and back to thee they come through fire that brings them home." All right, so there's obviously quite a lot in here. We'll try to pick it apart piece by piece. First, heavy Neoplatonic and idealist influence in this passage. Some key points from the poem. In the first line where she mentions everlasting reason ruling, that's a nod to the Logos, that is the organizing principle. In Christianity, this would be Christ himself as a person of the Trinity. In the Neoplatonic system, the focus is on the intelligibility of reality, that there's the same Logos that organizes a correspondence between all the levels. Christianity has a version of that as well, because the Logos creates reality after the will of God basically triggers the creation. Then, in thy mind, the beauteous world dost bear. Again, a kind of idealist notion that awareness, the mind, is fundamental. That is what reality is. So that's equivalent to God, that God is mental. And it's from his mind that the intelligibility of reality is possible, because our minds correspond to his, even though ours are, of course, finite, and his is infinite. We see that the duality of the material realm is part of the harmony that this Logos of the mind of God organizes. In the lines, "The elements by harmony thou dost constrain, that hot to cold and wet to dry are equal made. So again, duality has these two poles. They are equal until a consciousness comes along and assigns meaning and value to one over the other. And the real goal is to transcend the duality and get back to the unity from which they come. And then we get the mention of the threefold nature that mates thou soul, which spreads through nature's limbs harmonious. This should evoke the concept of the Trinity from Christianity. The threefold nature can also refer to the Neoplatonic triad, very similar to the Christian Trinity. The triad being the world soul. So there's the one, there's the intellect or nous, and there's the soul. 3, by the way, is the number of reconciling opposites, because 2 is the number of duality, which is what's required for something to exist. And of course, those two things have to ultimately be one in order to be coherent and intelligible to each other. So 2 plus 1 makes 3, and so that's how the Trinity is simultaneously 1 and 3 mathematically. This goes all the way back to Pythagorean thought, for instance. It's a very old concept of the symbolism and significance of numbers. So 3 here should be significant to us because we've been tracking this theme of the ascending soul back to its true nature, does so by collapsing dualities into unity. So in essence, the ascending soul in its divine nature creates trinities wherever it goes and encounters a duality by making things one and the 3 simultaneously. This is also an argument why the Trinity is kind of a symbolic and significant structure in the Christian cosmology, is because creation would be unintelligible if all of reality reduced just down to one thing. To have anything existing at all, you would need 2, but that 2 would need to be made 1, hence you require the Trinity, not just a simple 1. And then in the specific line, back to thee they come through fire that brings them home. Again, we see the same concept we had before of our suffering in this life is actually a refining fire. It's meant to catalyze the soul's return to God. It's not just suffering for the sake of it. It's part of separation that makes us an individual that exists out of the one, so that our identity is not just annihilated when it merges back to God. But the suffering is a necessary component of existence, and we ultimately redeem the material from its suffering when we transcend the dualities, take a higher perspective, and then bring that duality of suffering back into unity. And that brings in the concept of the mind's unblinded eye. That's another couple of lines down. And then to see thee is our end, who art our source and maker, Lord and path and goal. Such that the kind of goal of the cosmology as a whole and of the creation story is that the one which is infinite must become finite in order to create and in order to experience himself. And so these finite sparks of itself have to undergo separation, which necessarily entails duality, which means there's going to be joy and suffering, both what we would call fortune from the human egoic perspective. But then those separate sparks can, through the ascension process, remember their true nature as the divine, come back into unity with the divine. But unlike in, for instance, some of the non-dual traditions or some of the other forms of idealism, their individuality is not lost or annihilated when they merge back into union. Rather, you have the creator and the creation both divine and existing consubstantially together. And again, that is that structure of the Trinity, of the one that has to become 2 in order to ultimately become 3, which is actually just 1 again. And by the way, another cool mathematical expression of this is, of course, a point is 1. When you have 2 points, then you get a line, and a third point becomes a triangle, which is the simplest shape possible, and it's a symbol representing stability and harmony. Because of that, we see little triadic structures throughout all conceptions of reality, whether scientific or philosophical or mythical. We have the mind, body, spirit idea, heaven, earth, and underworld, past, present, future, proton, electron, neutron, the religious trinities, unity, division, and then the process of integration, so on and so forth. The Neoplatonic interpretation of all this, which of course heavily influenced Boethius, as did Christianity, as you can probably tell, is that it is this structure of three across all levels of reality, this one becoming two, coming back into unity by means of three, that is the intelligibility. It is the through line of intelligibility. It's the necessary structure required for things like knowledge to be possible at all. Chapter 10 is a rather interesting one. It's the first time in the book that I can find a true contradiction in what Lady Philosophy says. And that contradiction is interesting because it's one that actually belongs to Boethius, the writer, who, if you remember from the introductory video in this lecture series, lived at a time when the classical philosophies like Plato and Aristotle were starting to mix and give way to the Christian order of thought and medieval scholasticism. And Boethius was a figure and a thinker squarely in the middle and in the transition space between those two. So in chapter 10, we see that for how well they've played together so far, the Platonic and Neoplatonic and Christian systems start to butt heads in this one. So to start out here, we get the lines, "Everything that is said to be imperfect is held to be so by the absence of perfection, so that if a certain imperfection is visible in any class of things, it follows that there is also a proportion of perfection in it." So far so good. This sounds very much like the Christian idea of evil being the privation of the good rather than something that has existence in and of itself. Of course, because if God is the absolute good, evil can't actually have true existence. What happens is that the soul can forget its nature and thus degenerate via a kind of experiential separation, not ontological separation, and thus experience duality, suffering, and that suffering is the privation of the good that then returns to the good once the duality of joy and suffering, for example, is collapsed by the ascended soul. The trouble really starts in the next little bit. We get the lines, "It is the universal understanding of the human mind that God, the author of all things, is good. Since nothing can be conceived better than God, everyone agrees that that which has no superior is good. Reason shows that God is so good that we are convinced that his goodness is perfect. Otherwise, he couldn't be the author of creation. There would have to be something else possessing perfect goodness over and above God, which would seem to be superior to him and of greater antiquity. For all perfect things are obviously superior to those that are imperfect. Therefore, to avoid an unending argument, it must be admitted that the supreme God is to the highest degree filled with supreme and perfect goodness. But we have agreed that perfect good is true happiness, so that it follows that true happiness is to be found in the supreme God." So in it, we obviously have an argument for why God has to be seen as the supreme good, the true good, the capital G good. But it's also a very Platonic and Neoplatonic argument for monism. That is, that reality must be one, that there cannot be any ontic separation between God and creation. And so this is what gives way to kind of emanationist ontologies, where everything is nothing over and above God's nature or essence, all partaking in the one, though experiencing separation or difference. And so what's crucial here is that line, "to avoid an unending argument." That is essentially saying we have to avoid what in philosophy is called infinite regress, which means that your theory just goes on to infinity without any grounding. The problem with an ontology that goes on infinitely is that it has no epistemology. The epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, how we justify claims such as claims about what exists, which is ontology. The problem is that the epistemology has to couple with the ontology. They must be linked in order for ontological claims to have epistemic justification, for knowledge to be possible, for it to exist at all. And so an infinite ontology would require an infinite epistemology, and that would mean that that epistemology would be completely arbitrary. There would be no truth, there would be no knowledge, there would be no order, or intelligibility to anything, because it would simply be infinity with no distinction between things at all. We see the same point, and where it creates a problem for Christianity in the next bit, where it says, if goodness is a natural property of God, but something logically distinct from him, whenever we speak of God as the author of creation, an able mind might be able to imagine the existence of a power responsible for bringing together the two that were separate. Now, the problem here is not in the first part of that, because for the Christian system, God is goodness in nature, not just as a property. However, the key point to focus in on is bringing together the two that were separate. So, for instance, if there was a separation between God and the creation, in order for the two to interact, there would have to be a shared medium that was actually higher than God and higher than creation, and that encompassed both of them. And of course, that, as the argument went in the previous section, would not be possible. It would defeat the concept of God entirely as the highest. So where does the problem come in? Well, on the next page for me, we get the lines, since it is through the possession of happiness that people become happy, and since happiness is in fact divinity, it is clear that it is through the possession of divinity that they become happy. But by the same logic, as men become just through the possession of justice, or wise through the possession of wisdom, so those who possess divinity necessarily become divine. Each happy individual is therefore divine. So far, that's consistent with the Platonic and Neoplatonic system that we've had described up to this point. The next line, though, is while only God is so by nature, as many as you like may become so by participation, which is the Christian issue of the essence-energy distinction, or the creator-creation distinction. That is, in the Christian system, there is an ontological separation between God and the creation. The creation is created not as an emanation of God's ontological nature, but as something brand new, a new nature, ex nihilo. And so, as we already talked about, that separation creates a logical paradox, because there would need to be a medium above God that would contain both God and the creation. But in the Christian system, creation only participates in the energies of God, but does not share in the nature. This was one of the major debates at the time Boethius was alive between adherents to the old classical philosophical systems who were treating theology as kind of just another philosophy and were going by logic and reason alone, and the church fathers and the adherents of the nascent Christianity. So the essence-energies distinction was a big target for the philosophers because of the paradox that Lady Philosophy pointed out just before this line was included here. I talk about it here not necessarily because I have a solution to propose or that I side with one side or the other, but that this is a very good instance where we see Boethius as that thinker at the transition line between the two systems, who's trying to bring them together and has kind of caught one foot in both worlds. And there are quite a few similarities, of course. In Christianity, there's the idea of theosis, which is very similar to the kind of ascension path that we've been talking about. It's how the soul participates in the divine, but again, the soul does not share in the divine essence in the Christian system, even as it participates in the divine and divinizes itself in that sense. The difference being that in the kind of Platonic or Neoplatonic or Gnostic system, Hermetic system also, the soul has the divine essence. It has just experientially forgotten that it does. Whereas in the Christian system, it never does, but it can elevate itself to participate in the divinity. At the same time, if there is perfect unity, the Christian system points out that, well, the selfhood would seem to be annihilated then if the person returns into union with God. So if it's the same essence, then the self becomes impermanent and therefore unredeemable. It gets annihilated at a future point in time. There's also just the concept of piousness, right? It's a blemish on your piety if you say something like, my nature is God's, or I am God. Of course, in the Platonic system, the idea is not for kind of the egoic earthly personality to make that claim. It's for the soul to remember that that personality is not its essence, not its nature, and to say, I am that which precedes even the I. And it's a tricky thing to unravel, even in the writings of the Church Fathers, because they borrowed so much from Plato and from Neoplatonism. They make the argument that they can do that while not, of course, endorsing the entire system and not becoming, the same as the philosophers themselves. That's a topic for perhaps another video entirely. But again, these are the kind of theological and ontological questions that underlie all of these different worldviews that have many similarities, but when you really start digging in, there's some big differences with big implications. But again, for our purposes, it suffices to just use this as an example of the significance of Boethius's position as an intellectual, the last vestige of kind of the classical philosophies as they went into medieval scholasticism. And we'll conclude chapter 10 with a synthesis of how these two do intersect and play nicely together. Again, the central idea here for the psychology, or kind of the personal spiritual path of each individual, is the same in both, although it functions slightly differently. Whether in Neoplatonic theurgy, or Christian theosis, or simply just ascension, the idea is the divinization of the soul, either through remembrance or ascension through grace. And so the human then acts as a mediator between spirit and matter. The Neoplatonic idea is that man unites the horizontal plane of the material, the dual, that which is by itself meaningless, and the vertical plane, which is the ascent to the divine. In both systems, man is then at the center of a kind of cross structure, bringing together the vertical plane and the horizontal plane by virtue of the fact that man is the breath of God, or the spark of the divine, put into a material body. He elevates the material and also grounds the divine. And like I said, there's your symbol of the cross as the archetype for this. It's then no coincidence that, of course, Christ is crucified, being the mediator and being the archetype of this bridge between divine and earthly. In chapter 11, we really get back to focusing in on that path of ascension and what the individual is supposed to do to achieve it. In the poem that ends it, we get the lines, "Whoever deeply searches out the truth and will not be decoyed down false byways shall turn unto himself his inward gaze, shall bring his wandering thoughts and circle home, and teach his heart that what it seeks abroad it holds in its own treasuries within." So again, we're back to the fact that the journey is one of interiority, back to the explicitly Platonic ideas of remembrance. This is, by the way, connected to certain viewpoints of the Church Fathers, like Gregory Palamas in his defense of the Hesychast monks. The idea that the nous has to circle back inward to the heart to find the inner light, or the God within. So again, it's about going to the internal rather than focusing on anything that is external. To close out that chapter, we have a strictly Platonic sense. Man but recalls what once he knew and lost. For Plato, of course, all learning was in fact recollection from knowledge held pre-birth. In other words, from the wider soul that has had multiple lifetimes. This is certainly not a Christian idea. But again, Boethius is blending the two, and we see that again here at the end of chapter 11. In chapter 12, we get a bit of an argument for why awareness, or mind, or consciousness must be fundamental, as in the Neoplatonic system. We get the lines, "This world would never have coalesced into one form out of such diverse and antagonistic parts had there not been one who could unify such diversity. Their very diversity, in turn, would make them break out into dissension and tear apart and destroy the unity of the world unless there were a power capable of holding together what he had once woven." Now, in a past discussion on this book, we talked about why determinism is incoherent. This is an argument for why indeterminism is also incoherent. Basically, if reality was random at the fundamental level, there would have been no reason for anything to happen, and thus nothing would have, and there would have been the impossibility of intelligibility, which is something we must have. It's a certainty. Otherwise, we couldn't perceive, let alone theorize. So if determinism and indeterminism are both incoherent, the only remaining option is self-determinism. In other words, reality has to be that which can bring itself into existence. To do that, it must be able to direct itself at itself, and the only way that something can self-deterministically do that we know of is intentionality, a term for the directedness inherent to mind itself. And therefore, reality must fundamentally be mind, because if it weren't, there would be no reality. There'd be no intelligibility. There'd be no existence whatsoever. Incidentally, we do get another little argument against determinism a bit further down. In regulating the universe, he will need no external assistance. Otherwise, if he needs anything, he won't have complete sufficiency. This is a continuation of the argument from the previous chapter, essentially, that reality must be grounded in something. There must be a fundamental level, you could also consider it the highest level, in which everything is grounded, finds its ground state of being. If reality were purely deterministic, however, you would need an infinite chain of determined cause and effect interactions not grounded in anything at all. And of course, an infinite ontology would require an infinite epistemology, which is self-defeating because it would be completely arbitrary. So again, the necessity of self-determinism, not determinism, and not indeterminism. And that requires mind as fundamental, which in both Neoplatonic and Christian systems, and in the Hermetic system, that's the case. We then, in the next little bit, get a hint about how surrendering to God is essential for the ascension process. Lady Philosophy says, since we are right in thinking that God controls all things by the helm of goodness, and all things, as I have said, have a natural inclination towards the good, it can hardly be doubted, can it, that they are willingly governed and willingly obey the desires of him who controls them as things that are in harmony and accord with their helmsman. There is nothing, therefore, which could preserve its own nature as well as go against God. Now, the way I interpret this, based on everything else we've discussed in the Consolation of Philosophy, is that the ego, the part of our minds that maintains separation from the soul's true nature, the ego resists seeing itself as an expression of God, or an expression of the One for Neoplatonists, and therefore it rejects its true nature. Surrendering to God, rather, is allowing the greater part of the psyche, the true nature, to take over, rather than the ego complex. And so the ascension process can be compared to a leaf that once thought itself to be the tree, remembering that it is in fact a part of the tree. Or a wave, which of course has its own independent properties different from other waves, remembering that it is in fact the ocean. Very much a kind of non-dualist, Platonic, Neoplatonic concept here. But once again, we see the monic ontology here in contrast to the Christian dualism. So, the leaf's true nature is the tree. The tree is its nature. There is no separation between creator and creation at the level of the tree. So to the Neoplatonist or idealist or non-dualist would argue, our soul, our mind, is a creation of the same awareness that is the fundamental level of reality as well, such that we have the same essence as God. So now that we are approaching the end of Book 3, it really seems like that one line back in chapter, I think 10 it was, about creatures only being able to participate rather than having the nature of God, is kind of an aberration. And Boethius very much is in line more with the Neoplatonic or Platonic tradition than strictly in the theology of Christianity, which again entails the essence-energies distinction. To close out Book 3, we get a preview of what's to come in Book 4, which is when Lady Philosophy will address the classic problem of evil. For those who are unaware, that is a problem in theology and philosophy That if God is the absolute good, how is evil something that we have to deal with? Wouldn't a completely good God, if he was all-powerful, just create something in which evil was not possible in the first place? So Lady Philosophy and Boethius have a little bit of discussion about this as kind of a primer. She says, no one could doubt that God is omnipotent. Then, can God do evil? Boethius says no. And she says, so that evil is nothing, since that is what he cannot do, who can do anything? So we've already gotten kind of the concept of evil as a privation of the good rather than something that exists in and of itself. The way I think that this will be resolved is by returning to that theme of the duality of the material world. That is, that the meaning of where an event or a thing falls on that spectrum of good versus evil is really up to the perception of the consciousness that is undergoing the event or perceiving the thing, such that evil is actually an artifact of the soul's fallen perception, not something that exists in and of itself. And of course, if consciousness is fundamental, as in idealism and Neoplatonism, that makes perfect sense, because it is actually experiences that exist, and the material realm is just a set of experiences had by awareness through the lens of an individual mind. And remember that once a soul remembers its true nature, it unites back with God, who is absolute good, and thus transcends all of those dualities, such that even what was once perceived as evil is now reinterpreted as something that was a necessary catalyst and just a part of individuality and selfhood that led back to God in the first place. Recall again the Trinity structure. The one becomes two, and then add a third, and you return back to the one. We also get a little inkling of kind of a non-dual idea and a return to the concept of the unmoved mover. Lady Philosophy says, it rotates the moving sphere of the universe while remaining itself unmoved. So again, if we bring this into consciousness, there's the non-dual notion that awareness is unmoved, it's boundless, it's infinite. In it, there are no distinctions, and so it's unchanging. And yet the contents of awareness, the experiences, are actually what exist or stand out from that awareness, and they, of course, move while awareness remains unmoved. And then at the very end of Book 3, the final idea to leave us for now, Lady Philosophy references the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. If you recall this myth, Orpheus loses his love, Eurydice, who dies. He then goes down to the underworld to retrieve her. He sings such a beautiful song that Hades agrees, but with the one rule that on their way back up to the world of the mortals who are alive, he cannot look back at her. And of course he does, out of his anxiety to see if she's still there, and she gets pulled back into the underworld, and he has to go on alone. I think the myth serves to say here, don't focus on evil and darkness, but on the light as part of the ascension process. By its nature, light resolves the privation of itself, which is dark, right? If you're in a dark room, you turn on the light, the dark gets collapsed into the light. This way, the soul remains fixed on the divine, and it's able to transmute or alchemize dark to light. And so we see in the mental and spiritual sense a kind of alchemy of emotional lead, or darkness, or fear, concern over evil, into gold, which is the element associated with divinity, of course. And so that is the path of ascension. In other words, the soul, once it is reunited with the divine, is able to collapse duality. And so on your way to doing that, make use of the knowledge that there's evil so that you can avoid it, but especially you want to transmute it into light, and particularly within yourself. This is how you turn the lead of the ego and the limiting beliefs that it spawns into the gold of union and love and oneness. And with that, we have come to the end of Book 3 of the Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius. This was definitely a long one, jam-packed with lots of good wisdom and information. Like I said, this is the turning point of the entire work. And in the next installment, Book 4, we will tackle one of the most infamous problems of theology and philosophy, the problem of evil. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Even though it's free, your subscription really does help the community learn and grow together. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you in the next one when we tackle Book 4. Bye-bye.